throughout the 1850s, there was huge prosperity actually for Māori communities in Taranaki, especially around New Plymouth and Waitara. And Wiremu had come back in 1848, established gardens and farming, and had livestock and all of that sort of farming sort of activity going on. And we were selling that produce to settlers in New Plymouth at the time, making lots and lots of money as a result of that.
Māori and Taranaki traded. They had resource, they had land, and they were making a contribution to the growing Pākehā-originated economy of this area.
We were the ones supplying the tens of thousands of immigrants who were arriving in the country with nothing, with roofs over their heads, meat on their tables, and the ability to get started.
Of course, that was tinged with the fact that the incoming settlers were also looking for more land, so that was a tension which had to be handled, and in the end of the day that produced conflict.
We believe that the jealousy that led to the first war in Taranaki in 1860 came about as a result of their envy and greed for the Māori productivity that was so obvious all over the country.
If the Crown was serious about asserting its sovereignty over Māori people, people like Wiremu had to be stopped. And of course a way to stop him was finally worked out in 1860 when one of the other chiefs in our tribe offered the Peka Peka block for sale to the Crown, despite the fact that that chief had no authority to do that. And the Crown knew that that chief had no authority to do it, and so that was the start of the backward slide for Māori communities at that time. So prosperity up until this point, a war perpetrated against Māori in 1860, which lasted several years, a war which Māori comprehensively lost in the end, and as a result of losing that war, also lost not only their land, but also their sovereignty. And so the power of those chiefs like Wiremu and various other chiefs as well was thoroughly eroded by that time. These were the two bits of legislation that were really the start of the big land grab in Taranaki. And these two acts were designed to, one, punish the people for engaging in so-called rebellion, and the other was really about getting the land to be the punishment for that alleged act. And they had a huge impact on the people of Taranaki at that time, and probably have an impact still today, actually. Those acts in themselves, while the Crown said it now owned the land as a result of the passing of that legislation, and in fact it was enacted in 1865, so the acts were drawn up in 1863, enacted in 65, but they didn't actually have an immediate impact on the people at all, because although the Crown said it owned the land as a result of those acts, of course the people were still there. Still living on the landscape, still gardening, still doing their thing as Māori people did at that time. And the reality for them at that time didn't change at all. So while the Crown said one thing, Māori actually lived a different life altogether and simply didn't take any notice of that legislation at all. But later on that was to prove to be quite important in terms of the Crown acquisition of that property.
Has been, first of all, an ethnic cleansing. We've been actually forced off the land at the point of guns, and imprisoned or killed, and forced to live in communities like Parihaka, for instance, where we could continue to make a stand for our survival.
The land court process and other processes forced us to sell lands in order to work through those processes. There was a requirement that we pay the court in order to prove our claim to lands that we not only owned but were living on at the time. It was ridiculous. And as a result of that, it left families burdened financially, who then, within a very short period of time, had to sell the land in order to survive. And those lands were quickly acquired by some very astute, long-standing European families in this community today who have profited very well, and they live very well on the land. Their descendants have done very well. They are the doctors and the surgeons and the lawyers. And, you know, their wealth in taming this land has come at a cost, and the cost has been borne by us.
It's not their children who are caught up in the recidivism of the criminal justice system. There are higher numbers of our people who are clients of the mental health system. We don't have the homes that they have. It's not our children driving the BMWs. It's not our families going into joint ventures with local businesses. We can't do those things because we don't own the farms anymore that we used to own.
Basically, it was the destruction of a culture. And I speak of myself and my family and people in my area at the top of the South Island and both here in Bell Block and in Wellington. The things that we were deprived of: language, tikanga, culture, the tools in order to express what it meant to be Maori.
You strip a people from their culture, from their language, from their ethics, from their beliefs, from their principles, and they're left in a vacuum with nothing. And if there's nothing there to replace it, well, they will naturally fall to the bottom of the economic social structure of society.
Land is not simply an economic commodity. Land is a glue that coheres you in a society of which you are a part. And that also seemed to disappear from us.
They have no land to build on. They're not in a position to get money to rebuild anywhere else often. And when they do, their families are separated. And sometimes those separations will last for generations. In fact, sometimes members or lines of a family are lost altogether.
The people were essentially leaderless. There was poverty. There was growing sickness and disease that Māori people were succumbing to ever so slowly. And life from that point on was sort of a downhill landslide, really, for Māori communities at that time. And there was a deep demoralisation that set in for Māori communities at this time as well.
I can quite understand why some Māori are still very bitter today. It goes back to previous generations, to ancestors who have felt directly the consequences of land alienation and the taking of resources.
For those who say, oh, it all happened in the past, can I refer them to the land clearances in Scotland, the strife in Serbia, the strife in Ireland? These matters also occurred in the past, and the consequences of that hurt are still being felt down through the ages. So it has to be resolved, it has to be done well.
We don't, as New Zealanders, tend to learn very much about our own colonial history and the impact that it had on Māori communities. So there's no context that most of us get in the school system for making informed judgments and statements about these sorts of things.
I'm not asking people to be guilty. I am asking them to be responsible. History is never simply dealing with the past. We live in the present with the fruits of that history, and we live towards a future which expresses an aspiration which arises out of that history.
To have a grievance addressed, there needs to be an apology. You can't carry on saying, oh, well, it's not our fault. it was our ancestors who did it. You can't keep on saying that. There's a point at which we, Pākehā, represented by the Crown, need to say, we're really sorry.
The Crown makes this apology to Ngāti Ruanui, including Tangahoe and Pakakoi, to their ancestors, to their descendants, to the people of Ngāti Ruanui. The Crown profoundly regrets and unreservedly apologises to Ngāti Ruanui for its actions which have resulted in the loss of life during the Taranaki Wars and the virtual landlessness of Ngāti Ruanui in Taranaki, and have caused suffering and hardship to Ngāti Ruanui over generations to the present day. The Crown profoundly regrets and unreservedly apologises for the destructive and demoralising effects of its unconscionable actions on Ngāti Ruanui, which over the generations to the present day have undermined the basis of their society and autonomy and have had a devastating impact on their economy and development. The Crown profoundly regrets its failure to acknowledge the mana whenua and rangatiratanga of Ngāti Ruanui. The Crown apologises to Ngāti Ruanui for its breaches of the Treaty of Waitangi and its principles acknowledged by the Crown in this apology.
We asked ourselves, could we Māori forgive the Crown? Somebody said to us, nobody deserves to be forgiven. And we said, we agree with that. You don't earn forgiveness, it's a gift. It would be our gift from Māori to the Crown.
We still have things to put right in this country, and I think we're very positively engaged on what someone described it recently as a noble cause, where the Crown recognises that there was a treaty that was signed with Māori, the treaty was breached, a great deal of harm was caused, and that there is an obligation on us all to try and rectify that harm.
There's no legislative requirement to make this process happen. It's only happening because of the goodwill of the politicians. And to be fair, I think Māori don't want to bankrupt the country either. All Māori are saying is, let's just get enough money to make a fresh start, to create a future for our kids, for our grandchildren. But the issue then, of course, becomes, well, how much do you need to do that?
People saying that Māori are getting this, they're getting that, they want money for this, they want money for that. Perhaps my whakaaro is this. We're only just catching up from what was once taken from us. The language lay dormant. It was deprived, our parents were deprived of it. And so if we can look at it as being a catch-up time, one day you may not need a Māori department, you may not need a Māori this, a Māori that, because as Tariana Turia said, this is going to be a brown country.
It can never resolve the full extent of the grievances. If we were to settle all grievances in their entirety and have a full settlement, then the country would go broke. So to a certain extent, what we're dealing with is a symbolic aspect of a settlement, although there is a large amount of money that will be passed over, and commercial and cultural redress. But we cannot, as a contemporary New Zealand, turn the clock back in its entirety.
The ideal future is a negotiated future, where we sit down honestly with each other and we say, right, if we were to reshape New Zealand in the way that might have been envisaged in the treaty, what might we do? And if we have that discussion one day, Māori people might say to the government, well, actually, we quite like the way New Zealand is at the moment, let's just leave it as it is. But until you have that discussion, how do you know?
Māori retreated into themselves in a sense of isolation with their wounds. And only now are we beginning to turn that around and come out with some hope, aspiration, a desire to recapture tikanga Maori and te reo Maori with the Taranaki dialect. People like Ruakeri Hond and others are doing great pieces of work. I'm hopeful about the future. And because I'm hopeful about Maori, I'm hopeful about the province of Taranaki.